These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have the makings of a discovery? On both the d-file and e-file, where his knights mask his queen and rook respectively. Look for targets for the masked pieces and you see that on the d-file there is a loose black knight. All white needs is a good threat for his knight to make as it uncloaks the queen. You might first look at checks and find knight moves to e6, but then what? The knight is lost after pawn from f7 takes knight, and then if white plays queen takes knight, black has pawn from e6 takes queen, not good. But then look at the knight's other possible squares and notice knight moves to c6, a move that both attacks black's queen and keeps the white knight safe. Black moves his queen, and white has queen takes knight for free on his next move. Black to move. What is the best move? Now a glance at our current topic from a defensive standpoint. Black needs to move his queen to avoid pawn from b4 takes queen, so he considers queen takes at a3, which seems to win a loose pawn. But before making a venture like this, especially into enemy territory, look for any tactical ideas your opponent may have in place. Where does white have the kernel of a discovery? The sight of his knight masking his rook on the third rank is cause for alarm. If black plays queen takes at a3, white can attack black's king and queen at the same time with the crushing horizontal discovery knight moves to d5, check. Black to move. What is the best move? Building knight discoveries. In knight discoveries, as with any other sort, groundwork often must be laid, targets improved or lines cleared with preliminary exchanges. Start with the study on the left. One of the advantages of a fianchet bishop, i.e., a bishop positioned like black's on g7 here, is that if the knight comes to rest naturally on f6, or, for white, f3, black has the kernel of a discovered attack against the middle of the board. The pattern works especially well where, as here, the enemy king has been drawn off the back rank onto f2 or h2, for now the knight can give check with one move. All black needs is a suitable target for the bishop once unmasked. The protected white bishop now on d4 won't do, so black plays an exchange to upgrade it. 1. Rook takes bishop, 2. Queen takes rook, and now the board is arranged for black to take white's queen with the discovery knight moves to g4, check. If white is alert, he will reply to rook takes bishop by retreating his queen to c1 rather than by playing the recapture queen takes rook, naturally preferring to forfeit his bishop rather than lose his queen and face the additional trouble that follows afterwards. Black to move. What is the best move? Find the kernel of a discovery for black. His queen is masked by the knight on c6, his bishop, as in the previous case, is masked by the knight on f6. So now think about the targets available for the masked pieces. The knight on c3 is protected by a pawn, making it an unappetizing target for black's queen. But the knight on d4 is another matter. It is protected once, but by white's queen, and it is attacked once already by black's knight on c6. This suggests two sorts of possibilities: play the discovery with knight moves to g4, check. The same idea seen in the previous problem, then after the knight gets taken, play bishop takes knight. But of course this move order gains nothing. It's just a trade of pieces. So consider the other move order: play the exchange knight takes knight first. If white replies queen takes knight, play the discovery knight moves to g4, check. Winning the queen. Again, a preliminary exchange serves to upgrade the target. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is an alternative sequence. The kernel is similar, the fianchet bishop with a knight in front of it on f6. Again the target is a white knight on d4, again that knight is protected once and attacked once, again black has to decide whether to execute the discovery now or do a preliminary exchange first. One difference is that white's king is not available as a target. Another is that in the previous problem white was defending the targeted knight with a very valuable piece, his queen, and black was attacking it with a piece that was less valuable, his own knight, so it made sense to make the preliminary exchange first, turn the queen into a target, and then play the discovered attack against it. Here the situation is reversed. White guards his knight with another knight, and black attacks the targeted knight already with his queen. If black plays the preliminary exchange queen takes knight, check. First, he loses his queen and doesn't improve the target. So here he skips the preliminary exchange and just plays the discovery knight takes at e4. If white replies pawn from f3 takes knight, black has bishop takes knight, check. And nets a pawn. If white then takes the bishop with his e2 knight, black recaptures with his queen. Notice that with the sequence black has spent his dark squared bishop, which was doing important defensive work. Look at all the vulnerable dark squares near black's king. Black no longer has a bishop to patrol them. From black's standpoint, the wisdom of giving up that bishop to gain a pawn is not clear-cut. Some strong players might therefore conclude that the sequence just described wasn't black's best move after all, though it was what Bobby Fischer played in Siggy's Fischer, 1957. White to move. What is the best move? This position requires the same type of decision yet again. It is white who has the makings of a discovered attack a couple of different ways. His queen's path is masked in one direction by his bishop and in another by his knight. The direction of greatest interest is the one with a good target at the end of it, so white focuses on black's knight on d5. It's attacked once and defended once. If white were to give check with his own knight, say, with knight takes at f6, he could then take the d5 knight with his rook. But his own knight would be lost in the process, resulting in a gain of only a pawn. Since the black knight is guarded by black's queen, which would make a perfect target, the better sequence thus starts with a preliminary exchange. One rook takes knight, and now if black plays queen takes rook, white has the discovered attack knight takes at f6, check. Taking black's queen and turning a tidier profit. White to move. What is the best move? Two patterns here should attract your attention: the masking of white's bishop by his knight, and the battery of white rooks on the d-file. Since white's knight can give check on h6 while unmasking the bishop, everything is in place for a discovery except a suitable target for the bishop to attack. The knight on d7 won't do. After 1. Knight moves to h6, check. Pawn from g7 takes knight, 2. Bishop takes knight. White hasn't won anything. So upgrade the target by capturing it with another piece and then doing it a second time if necessary. Hence the usefulness of having the two rooks on the same file. 1 rook takes knight, knight takes rook, 2 rook takes knight, queen takes rook, and now white has created a worthy target for his bishop. Knight moves to h6, check. wins the queen after black fends off the check. In practice, of course, black probably would play queen moves to b6 on his second move rather than walk into the discovery, in which case white will have won 2 pieces for a rook. White to move. What is the best move? The potential for a discovered attack is obvious enough. The e4 knight will give check by moving to f6, then white's queen will take black's queen. But now inspect both targets in search of any obstacles to the idea's smooth execution. Black's queen is guarded by his knight. You might like to deal with this by capturing the knight, of course, but how? Consider all the white pieces. The rook on d1 is aimed at the bothersome knight, and the knight is next to black's king, which also is suggestive. Play with sequences that would allow the rook to help. First move the bishop out of its way violently, with 1. Bishop takes knight, pawn from g7 takes bishop. Now move order becomes important, if white starts with 2. Rook takes knight, check. He takes out the queen's guard but ruins the discovery he is planning. Black plays king takes rook, and now white's 3. Knight takes at f6 would no longer give check. So white should instead play 2. Knight takes at f6, check. Then black takes the knight with 2. Bishop takes knight, and now rather than 3. Queen takes queen, white plays 3. Rook takes knight, check. The priority of check requires black to attend to this threat to his king while the threat of queen takes queen hangs in the background. After king takes rook, or rook takes rook or bishop takes rook, the guardian of black's queen is gone and white takes it on the next move. The point, the queen's guard must be taken out late, not early, if the structure of the discovery is to be kept in place. Notice that after white plays queen takes queen at the end, black now has a remaining capture, bishop takes knight g5. You therefore must be careful to keep track of your gains and losses. White has gained 2 knights and lost 2 knights. He also has lost a bishop and a rook, but in return he has won a queen and 2 pawns, a good trade. Another, simpler way to look at this position is that white just plays the discovery knight takes knight, check. But, A, first sets it up with a preliminary capture, bishop takes knight, and then, B, interposes a checking move, rook takes knight, check, in the middle of it. Since checks require forced replies, it sometimes is possible to sneak them into a sequence like this with no loss of time. But white can't slip in that capture until he gets his own bishop off the d-file. That's why we have A here as well as B. Black to move. What is the best move? We turn from exchanges that upgrade or loosen a target to exchanges that draw a target into position. We saw earlier that a king's knight in its natural first position here, on f6 often can give check while unmasking an attack if the enemy king can be drawn forward onto the second rank. Here is another example. Notice the kernel of a discovery, black's f6 knight masks his queen. Examine the queen's possible target and see that the bishop on g5 is loose. It appears to be pinning black's knight to his queen, but its unprotected status makes it possible to turn the tables. Black just needs a target for his knight to attack as it moves out of the queen's way. As yet it has nothing, but black looks for any check he can give and finds bishop takes at f2. If white responds with king takes at f2, now black plays the discovery knight moves to g4, check. And wins back the bishop with queen takes bishop on his next move, netting a pawn and damaging white's defenses with the sequence. If white replies initially with king moves to d2 rather than king takes bishop, white has achieved a similar result more simply. White to move. What is the best move? Working with mate threats. Sometimes you may have the makings of a discovery but lack anything good for the knight to do when it unmasks the other piece. You would like to give check but aren't within range, and the knight has no obvious threats to make against other pieces either. Remember, then, another idea: look at the enemy king, see its vulnerabilities, and any pieces you have bearing down on its position. Sometimes adding the knight to those other pieces can create a threat of mate or other serious trouble that can anchor a discovered attack as effectively as a check. The point can be put more generally. You already know it is important to look for checks and to create ways to give them. It also is important to watch for and create mating threats, as they often serve similar purposes just as well and are easier to devise. Just aiming a piece at a square next to the enemy king may be enough to create a useful mating threat a move later when you aim a second piece at the same square and aim it at a loose enemy piece at the same time. In this first position, white has a classic arrangement for a discovered attack. His knight masks his fianchet bishop, which otherwise could take the loose black bishop on b7. But what threat can white make with his knight that will keep black busy? The knight seems far from any targets, and certainly can't give check from where it now sits. The key is to examine black's king and notice that white's queen already is aimed at a square next to it, h7. If white plays knight moves to g5, his knight adds more pressure to h7, and now white is a move from mate with queen takes at h7. The simple pattern of a knight on g5 supporting a mate threat by a queen aimed at h7 is familiar and should be absorbed. So knight moves to g5 is as effective as a check. Black is equally required to pause to fend off the threat. He will do it with queen takes knight, of course. That then leaves white to play bishop takes bishop. Is the trade of pieces a wash? No, because black's rook is stuck on a8, and will be taken by white on his next move. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight masks his queen, which otherwise could take the loose rook on a7. The only question is what White's knight might do while unmasking the attack. It can't give check, but might it again add to a threat against a square next to Black's king that already is under attack? Yes, White's queen is aimed at g7, and the knight can add more pressure to the square with knight moves to e6. Now White has queen takes at g7, checkmate. If Black tries to save his rook, so Black instead has to fend off the mating threat and let the rook go on the next move, losing the exchange. White's won. Knight moves to e6 is as good as a check. White to move. What is the best move? The kernel of the discovery is clear. White's knight masks his queen. Where can the knight go, and what can the queen then attack? The general answer should be clear from the look of the board. The knight can head in the king's direction, and then so can the queen. With a single move of the knight they both can attack h7. Meanwhile White's rook already attacks that square. With 3 pieces ready to bear down on the territory of Black's king, think in terms not of material but of mate. Consider knight moves to f6, imagine each possible response by Black, and each check White would have afterwards. You will find that no matter what Black plays, e.g., knight takes queen, or pawn from g7 takes knight, or rook takes knight, or pawn from h7 moves to h6, or pawn from g7 moves to g6, White is then able to play either queen takes at h7, checkmate, supported by the knight, or rook takes at h7, checkmate, supported by the knight. It's nevertheless important to notice all of those possibilities. The point, you can use a discovered attack not only to win material but to mate. You might have come at the position a bit differently. White is in a hole, he is down 2 pieces, though ahead 2 pawns. He needs to make something happen. The obvious focus of his attention is h7, where his rook and queen are aimed. A natural thought is rook takes at h7, check. With the double check knight moves to f6, check. Plus or knight moves to g5, check. Plus to follow if Black replies king takes rook. But you don't play a sacrifice like that unless you are sure it works, and as it turns out the double check doesn't end up achieving enough to save White. So you experiment with different move orders that likewise attack h7 and realize that knight moves to f6 is not only strong but conclusive. White to move. What is the best move? White c3 knight masks his queen, which otherwise could play queen takes queen. But for a discovery like this to work, the knight needs to threaten something even more valuable than the queen, viz., the king. Yet how? The knight is on c3, very far from the black king on g8. Still, examine the king's position closely. White's bishop on h6 cuts off the king's escape squares entirely. If the king were attacked it would have nowhere to go and might be mated. White can't attack it now, but might he move the knight to a position from which it could attack the king a move later? If so, that move might be as menacing as a check, given the constraints on the king's mobility. Here the knight can move toward the king with knight moves to d5 and a move later. White then would be able to play knight moves to e7, checkmate. Knight moves to d5 therefore is as effective as a check. Black must parry the threat or the game is over. But then it pretty much is over in any event because white plays queen takes queen. This position is a nice study in how even a knight that seems very far from the enemy king may have the power to make a mortal threat against it. It also illustrates the importance of watching the vulnerabilities of the kings at all times, no matter how distant they may seem from the rest of the action. White to move. What is the best move? And what checks would I then have? Learning to ask this question consistently is one of the secrets of great chess. This position offers two illustrations. The idea here is similar to the previous position but with a slight upgrade in complexity. Again White's knight prevents him from playing queen takes queen, again the knight is not yet in position to give check, and again Black's king is hemmed into the corner by the bishop on h6. The question is whether the knight on d4 can take advantage of the king's vulnerability in a way that requires Black to make a time-consuming reply. As in the previous position, look for places the knight can move that would place it one move away from giving check, and then consider the consequences of that potential check to see how bad it would be for Black. Here the knight can start by moving to c6, with a capture, and then be a move away from knight moves to e7, check, while also unmasking the threat of queen takes queen. Suppose Black replies with queen takes queen, and now White plays knight takes knight e7 plus. How serious a threat would that be? Black's only legal move would be king moves to h8, White looks for his next check and finds that he can mate by bringing in another piece, he moves his g5 knight to f7. So if White starts with knight takes knight c6, Black can't afford to play queen takes queen. Can he afford to instead play queen takes knight c6? That seems to extinguish White's threat against e7. But again White asks what checks he then would have and sees that this time queen moves to g7 would be mate. Black's queen was doing important defensive work on f6. So knight takes knight c6 wins either way. Black to move. What is the best move? More fun with knights. The kernel of a discovery for black should be obvious. His knight on f5 masks an attack that his queen otherwise would have against white's queen, which is loose. The f5 knight is on a light square and white's king is on a dark one, so the knight can't give check, but it still might be able to create enough trouble for white's king to produce the same result. Ask what sort of pressure the knight can put on the white king's position. By moving to g3 the knight at least cuts off the king's only flight square, h1. Does this matter? Yes, if black has another piece he can bring to bear on the king to squash it in its cramped position. Black imagines white replying to knight moves to g3 with queen takes queen and asks what his next check would be. He sees he would then have the game-ending move knight moves to e2, checkmate. Another mate with the two knights. So after black's initial move knight moves to g3 white can't afford to play queen takes queen after all. He has to do something to protect his king, e.g., with pawn from f2 takes knight, or queen takes knight d4, followed by black's recapture rook takes queen after first playing and pawn from g3 moves to e2, check. To move his knight to safety with check. One way or another white loses his queen. When you experiment with initial knight moves for black, such as knight moves to g3, the important thing to remember is that for now you don't care if the knight easily can be taken, because then you have queen takes queen. The question is just whether white can afford to ignore the knight move you are imagining. You answer this by assuming that he does ignore it and then asking what follow-up move you would have. White to move. What is the best move? Notice the kernel of a discovery in the white knight's masking of his queen. See how white's two knights both are within a move of bearing down on the king's general position. Observe that the king's position is cramped. The main structural difference lies in the target. If the f4 knight moves, white only has a bishop to attack with his unmasked queen. But the bishop already is attacked once and protected once, so it's a perfect occasion for a preliminary exchange. One rook takes bishop, and then if black recaptures queen takes rook, the pattern is much like the one in the previous frame. Two knight moves to g6 cuts off the black king's only escape square, allowing white to threaten mate with end pawn from d5 moves to e7, so after knight moves to g6 black can't play queen takes queen. He has to protect his king with a move like pawn from h7 takes knight, and then white is the one who plays queen takes queen. In a sequence like this you have to ask whether the attacked black queen might have some way to both remove itself from danger and defuse the mating threat by perhaps taking one of the pieces involved in it. That wasn't a problem in the previous position because the pieces contributing to the mate threat had protection. But here black could reply to white's two. Knight moves to g6 with queen takes knight d5, eliminating both the threat of queen takes queen and the mating threat of end pawn from d5 moves to e7. Yet after noticing such a capture consider, our mantra, the next check you would be able to play. There would be two here for white, queen takes at h7, check. Which would not work very well, and 2. And pawn from g6 moves to e7, which would work very well indeed not only because it forks black's king and queen, always think about forks when you move your knight, but because after the compulsory 2. King moves to h8 white blows open the h-file and mates there with 3. Queen takes at h7, check. King takes queen, 4. Rook moves to h1, check. Queen moves to h5, 5. Rook takes queen, checkmate. This sequence might look a little long, but notice that white can foresee the whole thing by simply asking what checks he would have after each of black's evasive maneuvers. There never are more than two for him to worry about here, and eventually they lead to mate. The trick is to remember all of your potential checking resources, including the rooks on your back rank, which can be moved to the h-file in a hurry. We will look more closely at this idea in the section on classic mating patterns. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight on f3 appears to be pinned to his queen by black's bishop in familiar fashion. But we have seen that sometimes a pin of a piece against the queen can be turned into a discovered attack by the queen. This is a particular danger where, as here, black has left the bishop loose in his eagerness to impose the pin. We just need a very threatening move for the knight. From f3 it can't check black's king, but study the king's position. Once more white's bishop bears down on it, attacking an adjacent square, the characteristically weak f7. It's weak because only black's king guards it. If white's knight can't give check, can it at least attack that square? Yes, with knight takes at e5, unmasking queen takes bishop. Now assess white's attack on f7 to see how serious it is. White's next move, it would need to be a check, and there's only one, is bishop takes at f7, check. In principle the king has three flight squares, but two of them, d7 and f7, are attacked, so black's only legal move will be king moves to e7. What is white's follow-up? Notice that now the king is severely boxed in, most of the squares around it are attacked. Again, the important thing is to look for the next check and to remember other pieces you can add to complete the net. Here the knight on c3 moves to d5, and it's mate. What this analysis means is that black has to respond defensively to one. Knight takes at e5, probably with pawn from d6 takes knight. This allows white queen takes bishop and the net gain of a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? A minor variation. White has the familiar pin of a knight here on f6 to black's queen. This time the pinning bishop isn't loose yet, but we still ask whether the knight, by moving out of the way, might be able to create pressure on the enemy king. Once more a bishop attacks the enemy f-pawn. Can black's knight add pressure to that square? Yes, with knight takes knight, now two black pieces are attacking f2. Is it a mate threat? Follow it out, looking for checks and asking what comes next after each white reply. It works like the previous problem. Black plays bishop moves to f2, check. White moves the king to e2, and then end pawn from c6 moves to d4 is mate for black. The point of analyzing the mate threat, of course, is just to determine that if black starts by playing knight takes knight, white can't afford to reply bishop takes queen. He has to play pawn from d3 takes knight, ending the mate threat but then losing a piece after white takes the bishop with his queen. The initial discovering move removes the bishop's guard, leaving it loose after all. White to move. What is the best move? More on mate threats, vertical and horizontal patterns. Find the kernel of a discovery for white. His knight masks his queen on the e-file. This formation of three pieces on a line should be instinctively visible. White needs to vacate the knight from e5 in a sufficiently threatening manner to allow him to play queen takes queen a move later, which likely means he needs the knight to threaten black's king. The knight can't give check, but it can move into the king's vicinity, and the bishop on g3 is aimed that way, too. Indeed, when the e5 knight moves, it will discover an attack by the bishop on both of the king's flight squares. Knight takes at c6 thus puts tremendous pressure on the king's position. It is just as effective a distraction as a check would be, because if black does anything to save his queen, white plays knight takes at a7, checkmate. On his next turn, he also threatens mate with knight takes queen, or any other move of the knight to e7. So instead black fends off the mate threat and loses his queen, which is loose, presently. We might as well sketch black's actual play in reply to one. Knight takes at c6, which can get a bit complicated. Black's best move is bishop takes at b2, check. You might expect white to reply king takes bishop, but no, that would allow black to play queen moves to f6, check. Next move, using the priority of check to remove his queen from danger. Instead white replies to bishop takes at b2 by simply moving his king to b1. Now black plays bishop takes knight to defuse the mate threat, and white has the move he has been waiting for, queen takes queen. Or instead of bishop takes knight, black could play his queen to a3, there it seems to be out of danger, and it guards both mating squares, a7 and e7. But then white simply goes ahead with knight moves to e7, check. Which requires black to capture the knight by playing queen takes knight. Again, white now has queen takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? The pattern we are considering should be no less evident when the three pieces involved are arranged horizontally, as they are here, rook knight rook on the fourth rank. Another signal for white to see is that black's rook is loose, It would make an easy target if white could get his knight out of the way and give check at the same time. He can't, for again his knight and the enemy king are on squares of different colors. But it still pays to study the king and its vulnerabilities. Black's king has little room to move. All its flight squares on the fourth rank are sealed off by white's king and pawns, so is g5. Indeed, the only place it can go is g6. It follows that white would mate if he could safely attack the king's current position and g6. A knight can do that sort of thing, but from what square? In theory there are two possibilities, e7 and h4. The latter square is out of reach, but by moving the knight to d5 white threatens knight moves to e7, checkmate. The initial move to d5 therefore is as threatening as a check. Black has to fend off the mate threat. If he tries to create a flight square for his king by moving his knight, then of course white has rook takes rook the point all along. But wait, we must consider whether black might somehow move his target to safety and extinguish the mate threat. He can sort of with one. Rook moves to c7, avoiding white's threat of rook takes rook and also guarding the mating square e7. But this still sacrifices the exchange, as white then has to. Knight takes rook, knight takes knight. White to move. What is the best move? This position doesn't involve a mating threat, but it depends on a similar train of thought. See the kernel of a discovery on the third rank. The white rook, white knight, and black queen in a line should be suggestive. What threat can the knight make as it evacuates e3? Black's king is out of range on this move. But look for moves that would allow the knight to give check a move later, and consider whether that check might be of interest, if not as a mating threat, then as part of a double attack. Black's king and rook are poised to be forked from h6. Knight moves to g4 thus threatens knight moves to h6, check. Black has the choice of replying to knight moves to g4 by, a, taking the knight with the h5 pawn, losing his queen to rook takes queen, and then taking white's rook with the pawn that would then be on g4, or, b, he can save the queen and lose the exchange to the coming knight fork. Either way white takes a decisive advantage. This position resembles the mating threats we have been considering lately, because in either case the unmasking knight doesn't check or capture as it unveils the discovered attack, rather, it moves into position to threaten a crushing blow a move later. Black to move. What is the best move? We always are alert for pieces on the same line, and so have no trouble here seeing the kernel of a discovery for black on the fifth rank. If his knight could make a substantial enough threat, he could play queen takes queen a move later. Since the knight can't give check, think about other threats it could make. Is there a square it can reach from which it would then be able to give a check with interesting implications? Yes, with knight takes at e4 black unmasks queen takes queen, and also moves the knight into position to take white's rook with check on the next move. And knight takes at e4 does more, it puts the knight into the path of black's queen, creating the kernel of a second discovery by black on the e-file. If white retreats his queen, black thus plays knight takes rook d2 plus and then queen takes rook e1 after white moves his king. To prevent all this, white presumably will respond to knight takes at e4 with queen takes queen. Black was ready to allow this because his queen has protection from the bishop at g7, but notice the importance of no capturing right away. Exhaust your checks first. After white plays queen takes queen, black picks up white's rook with knight takes rook, check. Then, after white's king moves, there still is time for black to play bishop takes queen or pawn from d6 takes queen, the priority of check. White to move. What is the best move? Discover check with the knight. Now some examples of patterns that arise when the knight discovers check, giving it two moves with which to create havoc. To the left probably is the simplest possible example. The kernel of the discovery should be obvious enough, as it consists of white's only remaining pieces. If the knight moves from f6, the bishop checks black's king. This means the knight will have two unfettered moves in a row. So look for enemy pieces on the same color square as the knight, be ready to move it in any direction. The natural target is the queen if it can be reached, and so it can. One knight moves to e4, king moves to g8, two knight takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? The simple form again, this time running vertically. The kernel of the discovery should be evident on the e-file. White sees that the king is at the other end of it and thus realizes that his knight will have a free move. Black's queen always is a favored target, here it's on a light square, as is the knight, so it can be reached the move after next. One knight moves to c5, check. King moves to f8, 2. Knight takes queen wins the queen for the knight. White to move. What is the best move? The cluster on b3 and c4 is the kernel of a discovered check. White will attack black's king with any move of his knight out of the bishop's path. Since the knight is on a light square, look for enemy pieces also on light squares that might make good targets. You thus find the black rook on a8, the black bishop on b7, and the black knight on g4. The rook is the least attractive of these possibilities because it's guarded. As between black's knight and bishop, the knight makes the better target because white can pick up a pawn along the way. One knight takes at e5, check. 2. King moves to h8, and now knight takes knight.